There was a time when Elliot believed in the goodness of people. He had spent years offering kindness without expecting anything in return. He lent a helping hand to friends who needed support, a shoulder to cry on for those who suffered, and a warm smile for strangers who seemed lost in the cold world around them. But kindness, he learned, was not always appreciated. It was consumed, devoured, drained from him as if he were nothing more than an endless well. They took everything from him. His so-called friends leaned on him for emotional support, yet vanished when he needed someone to confide in. His colleagues praised his generosity, but never truly respected him. Even strangers sensed his warmth and clung to him, feeding off his kindness like parasites. And then Elliot stopped. The first to notice was his neighbor, Mrs. Dorsey, a frail woman in her 70s who relied on him to carry her groceries every week. When she knocked on his door, her voice laced with expectation, Elliot simply ignored it. The knocking turned to pounding, then silence. Days later, he saw her through the window, struggling with her bags. Her frail hands trembled, and she gasped for breath. Elliot watched and did nothing. She collapsed on the sidewalk moments later. Then came his friend Damien, who frequently borrowed money under the pretense of temporary hardship, but never repaid a cent. When he asked for help again, desperation in his voice, Elliot only smiled. "You'll figure it out," he said before walking away. A week later, Damien lost everything, his car, his apartment, and eventually his mind. Elliot's absence of kindness spread like an unseen force, an invisible toxin that gnawed away at those who had fed on his goodwill. The more he withheld, the more they suffered. Some lost their minds, others their health, and some their lives. But something even more disturbing began to happen. Elliot started seeing them in the corners of his vision. Shadows, hunched figures, faces drained of color and vitality. At first, he thought it was paranoia, but the figures persisted, appearing in reflections behind curtains just at the edge of the light. One night, as he lay in bed, a whisper slithered into his ear. "You took it away, and now we are nothing." His breath caught in his throat. He sat up, heart pounding, scanning the darkness of his room. Nothing. But as he turned toward the mirror across from his bed, his own reflection did not move. It stood there, still and empty-eyed, and then it grinned. Sleep became impossible. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. His phone rang in the dead of night, but when he answered, all he heard was ragged breathing. The figures drew closer, stepping out of the shadows. Their faces were familiar, Mrs. Dorsey, Damien, and many others who had relied on him. But they were wrong. He hadn't taken anything. He had simply stopped giving. Hadn't they deserved it? Hadn't they drained him until there was nothing left? One night, exhausted and desperate for rest, Elliot whispered into the dark, "What do you want?" A voice, hoarse and distant, replied, "To feel again." The shadows surged forward, their eyes hollow and pleading, their mouths stretched wide, desperate to drink from the well of kindness once more. Elliot screamed as cold hands reached for him, dragging him down into the darkness. Elliot awoke with a jolt, his breath ragged, his body drenched in sweat. The room was silent, but the weight of unseen eyes lingered in the air. His hands trembled as he reached for his bedside lamp, hesitating before switching it on. The dim glow revealed an empty space. No shadows lurking, no figures watching. But he knew better. They were still here. He dragged himself out of bed, his feet heavy as if the very air around him resisted his movement. In the mirror, his reflection had returned to normal, but something was off. His skin was paler, his eyes sunken, as though something had been siphoned from him overnight. He felt it too, an emptiness creeping through his veins, as if his own essence was slipping away. This wasn't just guilt. This was something else entirely. Elliot avoided mirrors for the rest of the day, but the world around him had changed. People moved slower, their faces drained of expression. He saw his neighbor's house. Mrs. Dorsey's windows were dark, lifeless. She had been taken away after collapsing outside, and her home now felt like a grave. At work, Damien's desk was abandoned. Someone whispered that he had been found wandering the streets, muttering to himself, his eyes hollow. Elliot felt no remorse, no sadness, only satisfaction. Yet the shadows persisted. They clung to him like a sickness. Their whispers were growing bolder. You took it away. We need it back. That night, Elliot locked his doors, bolted his windows, and curled beneath his sheets. But the moment he closed his eyes, the cold crept in. The whispers became voices, then pleas, then agonized wails. Give it back! Give it back! His chest tightened as icy fingers pressed against his skin. He gasped, struggling, but his body was paralyzed. And then, the worst of it, he felt something being pulled from him. A raw, tearing sensation deep inside, as though his very soul was unraveling. He thrashed, forcing himself awake, and found himself staring into a pair of hollow, lifeless eyes. Damien stood at the foot of his bed, his face gaunt, his mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. You were the only thing keeping us alive, he rasped. You stopped, and now we rot. Elliot scrambled back, pressing himself against the headboard. You used me, he choked out. You all did. You drained me dry. Damien's grin widened, but his skin cracked at the motion, peeling away like dried paper. And you loved it, didn't you? Elliot opened his mouth to protest, but the truth lodged itself in his throat. Hadn't he always wanted to be needed? Hadn't he felt a twisted sense of purpose in being their source of warmth? And when he took it away, when he watched them crumble, hadn't he felt something else? Power. A surge of cold wrapped around his limbs, dragging him downward. The room darkened, the figures swarming closer. Elliot clawed at his sheets, at the air, at anything. But they weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to make him one of them. He screamed as the last of his warmth was ripped away, his skin paling, his veins turning black. His last breath left his lips in a misty exhale, and then he was gone. The house stood silent. The shadows receded. The whispers faded. And then, somewhere, a knock at the door. A young man, new to the neighborhood, stood outside, arms full of groceries. He had heard an old woman once lived here. Maybe she needed help. Inside, a shadow stirred. The cycle would begin again.